This lecture will look at the apex of Roman power as it spreads all the way up to the UK through modern-day Romania and pushing on the boundaries of Germania. This leads us into the High Empire, following what we looked at last time with the Flavians. And, as with the Flavians, the military-minded emperor of Vespasian, so too will we find repeated reference to military rulers and competency in the High Empire, where rulers will, one after another, adopt their chosen successor instead of giving the right to rule to their sons. This is a very successful strategy that only ends in 192 Common Era with the death of Commodus because an emperor did not adopt a competent ruler and instead gave it to his son.
With the assassination in 96 Common Era of the last Flavian Emperor Domitian, we have a new era that is going to be dawning. With the succession of the senator Nerva, who was childless, he is then forced to appoint a successor and adopt. What he does is find someone who is an able administrator rather than an heir. So, for nearly a century, Rome will be run by, again, administrators, those people who have already proven themselves to be good governors. This includes Trajan, Hadrian, and Antonius Pius. They all choose heirs. Thus, we have political stability because we have people that have already demonstrated themselves to be good governors and good administrators.
The emperor that establishes this new tradition of adopting their heirs is Trajan. So we will look now at the 2nd century while Rome is at its peak, extending all the way up to England, all the way over to modern-day Romania across the Danube River, and pushing on the Rhine River and the boundaries between Rome and Germania. Now, Trajan is going to hail from Italica Hispania, or southern Spain. He will be the governor of Upper Germany, or Germania, and he will choose his successor Hadrian, as will Hadrian choose his successors, the Antonines. Already demonstrating his competence as a ruler, serving as a Roman general, being born in Italica, Spain, and governing Upper Germany, he will be significantly the first non-native Italian ruler to be brought to Rome to become the next emperor. He establishes his reputation relatively early on by establishing far-reaching social, governmental, and military reforms. Thus, he will be granted by the Senate the title Optimus, or the best. In the late antiquity, his popularity is known, for senators who would hail a new emperor would wish them that they be Felicitor Augusto melior Traiano, or luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan. Hence, they are linked in the late antique mind, these two great popular emperors.
Now, Trajan is most commonly shown as a full-length statue as imperator, or as a general and emperor, as head of the army. Here he's going to be holding a spear, wearing armor and boots, prepared to go out into the field and lead his men, much like Augustus as general from Prima Porta. However, unlike Augustus, he's shown as a middle-aged man who never ages. Thus, we have a compromise between republican and imperial virtues and values. The Republicans appreciate those hard-bitten and won characteristics such as loyalty, things that come with age, whereas the emperors established by Augustus want to show themselves as descended from gods, thus young and beautiful. So this brings them both together. We find also that the haircut, this forward swept haircut, is also going to be one of the most defining features of Trajan, making him easily identifiable. The cuirass that he wears, interestingly, does not record a specific event of one of his military victories, like Augustus does with his victory over the Parthians. Instead, it's going to showcase that he is the Pontifex Maximus, or the chief priest of the state religion, for we have mirror images of victories that press their knees into the backs of bulls, cutting their throats. Thus, the bull is the might of the Roman army, thus we are ensuring victory. The composition is actually derived from the 5th century Athens and conflates two motifs. One, a victory crowning a conqueror, and two, the emperor slaying a bull in thanksgiving for a military victory. These two things together are going to showcase that the emperor, just as Augustus established before him and is the first Pontifex Maximus, is the chief priest of the state religion, and thus is responsible for sacrificing to the gods and ensuring well-being for the Roman family. So he self-consciously would connect himself to Augustus as the inheritor of this classical tradition and as a role as general. He would also set up in Romania, in Dacia, a massive statue to himself, showcasing this type of image as general.
In the Forum Romanum, or Roman Forum, the heart of the Roman Empire, where we find several important basilicas, temples, and of course the crossroads of ancient Rome overlooking the Colosseum, we know he also associates himself with Augustus, given his chosen location and shape of his forum.
And like Augustus before him, whom he wanted to associate himself with so closely, we have many major building campaigns that he carries out not only in the capital but the provinces, thus cementing his reputation as a man of the people who builds for the common good. The largest of these projects is going to be found in the Forum proper, which is his Forum of Trajan and the markets of Trajan, both built with the spoils of war from Dacia, or modern-day Romania, and his conquests there. These are going to be much, much larger than all previous forums combined, including that of Julius Caesar and Augustus, Nerva, Vespasian. All of them are going to pale in comparison. The chief architect on this project is Apollodorus of Damascus, a Greek who is a military engineer who worked with and for Trajan in the Dacian Wars and built the world-famous bridge to allow Roman troops to cross over the Danube River. His plan would emulate the Forum Augustum right next to it. The Forum Augustum, or the Forum of Augustus, is going to have dual-ended exedrae surrounding the center temple to the deified dead. The distinctive semicircular exedrae, or these openings to the side, are going to allow one to enter into the forum that leads to the Temple of Augustus, which is dedicated to the newly deified emperor himself.
In the Forum, we have an additional basilica with exedrae and/or these apses that come out to the side, just like we find in the Forum of Augustus. Then, behind it, we have libraries and the Column of Trajan, the only part to survive from this Forum. And then finally, after his death and deification, there was a temple built to the new god Trajan behind it. Built with the spoils of war from Dacia, or modern-day Romania, we know that the Forum of Trajan was incredibly impressive. Visitors marveled at the expense and the engineering prowess that would have taken to build it. He brought Apollodorus of Damascus, this Greek, who was also an outsider, to Rome as his civil engineer because he had been his military engineer on campaign in Romania. The work of Apollodorus must have been impressive, for in 357, when the new Emperor Constantine visited Rome, he stopped in his tracks astonished, marveled at Trajan's Forum, and stated, "which cannot be described with words, and could never again be attempted by mortal men." In the Forum, we would enter, much like later Christian basilicas, into an atrium or courtyard, where there would have been an equestrian portrait of Trajan. This leads us to the Basilica Ulpia, or a basilica or law court, then the Column of Trajan, flanked by libraries, until we finally get to the temple to the deified Trajan.
Leading from the exterior entryway, we have the Basilica Ulpia, also designed by Apollodorus of Damascus to remind one of the dual-ended exedra of the Forum of Augustus. Here we find that the name Basilica Ulpia is taken from the family name of Trajan, Ulpius. It is 400 feet long and 200 feet wide, massive, much larger than any basilica before it, and would allow an elevated platform for judges to hear public grievances. It could be understood as a law court. Thus, it is a public forum for the Roman people. Behind it, we of course would see that we have two aisles that flank the nave, and separating off, we can have different discussions in different sides of this basilica. Here is a reconstruction of the interior, which would have two levels, the clear story opening up and letting in light on the second level, decorated with white and colored marbles. It would have been very ornate. Thus, of course, we would have the interior bathed in light, something that the Egyptians had wanted when they invented the clear story. Outside, we would have been able to view the first massive column to an emperor recording his great military exploits.
Here is the Forum of Trajan today. Obviously, the columns surrounding it give you an indication of the scale and complexity of the structure. But the only object to remain intact is the column of Trajan in the center here. Now, the column is 128 feet tall. Today, it has an image of St. Peter surmounting it. Originally, we have coins that show us a nude statue of Trajan originally is going to surmount this massive column. Popes in the 16th century replaced it with an image of the first Pope, or St. Peter. Hence, we find that Christianity is going to become the inheritor of ancient Rome. The statue that would have originally surmounted it is in a long line and tradition of heroic nude portraits that were common among leaders going back to the Hellenistic age. We find the Colossus of Nero, another example that we discussed last time. At the base of the column, we find Trajan's tomb as he was cremated. It is decorated in low relief with Dacian arms and armor to show us the peoples that he conquered, and also in that Roman ethnographic tradition to record what they looked like, so that we have a record of these ancient peoples that were defeated by the Romans. Now, the column itself is the first of its kind, yet is going to be illustrating series of historical and military events that took place during the conquest of Dacia in a 625-foot band that rotates lower left to upper right all the way around this column. But it merely illustrates the scenes like scrolls in the neighboring libraries, for they do not adopt codices yet until late antiquity. Instead, the books of the day would have been rolled around two scrolls on each side and then unfurled as you need to read it left to right. Now, they're going to indicate that we are carrying on this tradition that we discussed before with Lars Poulena, in which we lay out one's events or one's conquests. And they also are like painted military campaigns that would be carried in processions and or on coins. The episodes on the column of Trajan glorify Trajan as a military leader who was at every important stage of this campaign. There were two said campaigns against the Romanians, or the Dacians as the Romans called them. There are over 150 individual episodes on the column that spiral upwards, and over 2,500 figures. Now at the bottom we have a fairly low relief, assuming that the viewer can get close to it and thus can discern what is happening relatively easily. Now at the bottom we begin with the river god representing the Danube, showing us where we are in reference to geography. So we are beginning at the Danube River. At the time, that is what divided the Roman Empire from the Dacians. Trajan then leads his army out of a city and then across this river, thanks to the engineering prowess of Apollodorus of Damascus, his military engineer and his architect for the forum in which we now stand looking at this. Now we know that the Romans were successful in battle not because they fought most of the time, but because they prepared. They build siege equipment, they build army camps, they are going to dig in building trenches, they prepare building catapults. Thus, of course, fighting takes up a very minimal amount of each military campaign.
The scenes are not only heroic, showing the Romans triumphing over the Dacians, but also quite frank, as we find soldiers are tended to who have been wounded. Thus we have the understanding that that wasn't entirely successful, and it shows the hardships of Roman soldiers. We have the heroism, though showcased even by the Dacians. The Dacian king here, Decebalus, who's going to be taking his own life before he is captured. Now this is considered to be a brave act. He would have been paraded down the Via Sacra on his triumphal return, Trajan would have, bringing him back to Rome as a slave, as a prisoner of war. So we find this is also carrying on the tradition of noble suicide that we discussed going back to Pergamon, and the Gallic chieftain who's going to be taking his own life and his wife's. Most of the scenes are actually not battles, but are preparation for the battles to come, and they reflect the actual strategy of the Romans. We also see here transportation. We need to get goods, men, and materiel to the battle site, to this foreign land. We need to build bridges. We need to discuss strategy with the troops and addressing them. Therefore, it is not an historical record in the sense that we would understand it, however, because all of the scenes are already known. They are tropes. They are recognizable compositions taken from coins and the reverses of coins and stone reliefs. Because from every direction, we see Trajan directly involved in the operation. There is no place that he is not visible. This is going to remind those in Rome of the coins that show emperors addressing troops, people preparing for battle, etc. And so it is not to be understood as exactly historical.
As we move to the upper sections of the column of Trajan, we notice that the bands increase in height and they are going to be more deeply undercut. Thus, they are no longer the very shallow, low relief as we see in the lower sections. So the artists and the sculptors knew that it would be difficult to see far up into the air, over 100 feet, what is happening. So they tried to increase the graphic nature, much like the effects of sunken relief in Egypt, as much as they could. The column can be compared to the Palette of Narmer from pre-dynastic Egypt, whereby each is technically an historical fiction, showing us events that people would be familiar with from coins and then processional paintings. But in fact, this is not what transpired. We do not have the emperor at each one of these scenes. They are stock imagery, if you will, of military campaigns, not showing us exactly what happened in Dacia.
Right next to the Forum of Trajan, we have an equally impressive architectural structure with the markets of Trajan, which are made up of shops and administrative offices. Here we find that Apollodorus of Damascus was given the challenge of transforming the natural slope of a hill into a multi-leveled complex by using concrete. This required cutting away 600,000 square feet from the Quirinal Hill, which is 125 feet tall, the exact height of the column of Trajan. Now, this was part of a previous commercial center that was razed, that was destroyed in order to make room for and way for Trajan's Forum. Replacing that with these markets was only appropriate. Now, the function and form of the markets is akin to a modern-day shopping mall. In the front, we see a hemicycle facade, which is going to be a semicircular recess that's going to move inward, made up of exposed brick, which is not concealed with marble revetment to make it look more expensive like the Forum proper. Instead, we have on the interior 2 floors of shops, which would have sold anything from clothes to food and other wares such as art. This is very similar to the multi-structured and multi-tiered floors of a modern-day shopping mall and functions the exact same way. The fenestrated sequence of groin vaults making up this interior space is going to take barrel vaults placed end to end that are 2 levels high, that would then let in light through the clerestory, much as the second level did in the Basilica Ulpia. The restructured section seen here in the reconstruction gives one an idea of the scale and how one would move through the lower and upper levels, shopping in this area in downtown Rome. Please take a moment to watch the documentary Engineering an Empire in the section dedicated to how this was actually created, from 58 minutes to an hour and 2. Of course, the markets were not the only gift that Trajan gave to the people of Rome. He also builds a new road that extended the Via Appia in 109. At this time, the Senate would then erect an arch honoring where this road entered Benevento. The relief carvings would herald the emperor's achievements, but is not considered a traditional triumphal arch, for it does not actually celebrate a triumph of a military victory where 5,000 enemies were conquered on the battlefield. Instead, it will hold up to emulation and to adulation the great public works projects that Trajan is responsible for, making Rome better for the lower classes as well as everyone else. Here we find that the form of the Arch of Trajan is almost identical to that of Titus, but Trajan's has relief panels on both facades and acts more like a billboard than does the Arch of Titus, whereas we must walk through the Arch of Titus to look at the 2 relief panels, as Titus is going to be victorious and accompanied by allegorical figures. Instead, now with Trajan, we can see front and back, coming and going, the reliefs of what the emperor did, what he represents. In the spandrels, we're going to find these rectangular sections that are going to flank these arcuated openings, that they still have victories that are going to show us that Trajan is victorious like Titus. We have the composite order column still retained, bringing together the Ionic volutes with the Acanthus scrolls. But we also have an addition of personifications or allegories of the 4 seasons, river gods. Thus, we're trying to show that Rome is victorious in all seasons and throughout the world, because we have the seasons and river gods are going to indicate the different sections and places in the world geographically. Now, each one of these sections showcases a different aspect of Trajan's rule, such as entering Rome after a military campaign, such as at Dacia, distributing largesse to needy children, that we will see in a moment, founding colonies for army veterans, building a new port at Ostia, and as the guarantor of peace and security. For instance, Trajan sets up a project whereby the state lends money and with the interest feeds poor children throughout the empire. Here we see Trajan distributing largesse or money to children with the personification of Italian cities with turreted crowns, showing that they are going to be living in these different cities. Now, the personification of cities is quite common and continues into modernity, whereby you will have a woman with turrets and or building-like structures as a crown. And so we understand them as a city, not as a person. So this is the first known example where we see lower classes shown in official Roman monuments. Bringing together the real and the allegorical is also going to be taken from the Arch of Titus. So much of this is going to be dedicated to and modeled after the arch, which is the entryway to the Roman Forum today. We find that Trajan himself intermingles with divinities. Jupiter, for instance, the king of the gods, is going to hand him a thunderbolt, showing that he has dominion over the earth. Thus, we have a divinely sanctioned ruler here that becomes the norm in official Roman art. We find there's also a bearded man who is added later to this relief, and this is Hadrian. When he becomes emperor, we find that he's retroactively added to these monuments of his adopted father, Trajan. Thus, if we consider the message seen here with the Arch of Trajan, we are stating that this emperor is all things to all Romans, and it is finished after his death, so it is not heretical, it is not blasphemous in the same way that Domitian's monuments were.
Following Trajan, Hadrian will be his chosen successor and fellow Spaniard, whom he adopts again as a middle-aged man, carrying on this idea that Roman emperors should prove themselves as capable administrators before taking power. Now we know that Hadrian admired Greek culture quite a bit, so much so that he's known as a Philhellenic, or a Greek-loving Roman. He's even called Graculus for being the Greekling.
We know that Hadrian travels widely, heading to the Greek East, and seeing most of his vast empire. But he is the first emperor to not expand the territory of Rome. He's very much impressed with the monuments and the people that he meets in ancient Greece, which is why he takes on a Greek affectation. Now, looking at this change in policy of emperors not expanding the territory, we see the defensive strategy personified and embodied in Hadrian's Wall, for he's mainly focused on maintaining the territory and this peace and prosperity of the people that he already rules. So please take time to watch the short section on engineering an empire, just 5 minutes, showing how this massive wall was built and how impressive it was.
Now we know that more portraits than any other emperor outside of Augustus are going to survive of Hadrian. This shows us how popular he was. Thus we find that emperors will emulate him after Hadrian.
As noted, Hadrian is going to consider himself a follower of the Greek tradition, so he adopts what Trajan had and shows himself as a mature man who never ages, so just as the middle-aged Trajan, this is the same. However, we find that Trajan does not show himself with a beard. In fact, Hadrian is the first Roman emperor to grow a beard as a Greek affectation. Romans shaved to show how superior and clean they were to all other civilizations who did not have running water, public fountains, and baths. So the Romans not wearing beards shows us this is a very self-conscious adaptation and adoption by way of Hadrian to show that he is going to be sympathetic to the Greeks and wishes to rebuild and bring back the Periclean golden age of Athens in the classical period. The model that we have here is going to be of Augustus, where we have Greek athletes. However, for Trajan and for Hadrian following him, it's going to be mature men. Specifically for Hadrian, mature Greek men who are shown with beards, like the Riace warrior and Pericles. Now, Hadrian is so popular that every subsequent Roman emperor until Constantine will grow a beard as well. We know that Hadrian was an active architect and even writes his own treatise on architecture like Vitruvius. He works on his projects, restoring the Forum of Augustus, the Baths of Agrippa, and the Pantheon. He builds new structures such as the Temple of Venus in Roma and the mausoleum and villa at Tivoli. We know that he forces Apollodorus of Damascus, the architect of his adopted father, to commit suicide, as Apollodorus insulted Hadrian on multiple occasions, saying that he makes his pumpkin domes, and is of course going to be quite disparaging of the emperor's accomplishments.
One of the most important structures that Hadrian commissions is the rebuilding of the Pantheon, which existed and had burned down. That's why Marcus Agrippa's name is on the facade of this very famous and best surviving building from antiquity.
The Pantheon is, in fact, the best surviving building from antiquity. It would be in 609 that Pope Boniface IV would consecrate the structure as a church dedicated to Saint Mary of the Martyrs. It was then repaired and was taken care of by many popes subsequently in 731, 1434, 1442, 1524, and 1560. Thus we find that it is a well-preserved monument. Now, the monument is originally dedicated, as the name suggests, to all gods, hence the Pantheon. Pan for all, and theos, which is where we get the root word for gods, or Zeus, or gods here. So we have this structure dedicated to the 7 planetary deities, the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. So we have 7 niches for these gods and goddesses. It is in fact a hybrid of a Greek temple front with a hemispherical dome on a drum, so it is unique. The secular temple here that's going to be built for Hadrian reinforces the celestial divination, as we find the oculus above acts as the sun that moves through the structure just as the sun moves overhead during the day. If we look at a cutaway of the Pantheon, we can see these 7 exedra, or niches, which represents these 7 planets, these 7 astral bodies that are going to be rotating around the central oculus, the sun. So we have this notion that it is a microcosmic reflection of the cosmos and the universe as the Romans understood it.
Now, on the facade, we find on the entablature, we have in Latin spelled out, this is Agrippa's Pantheon. Marcus Agrippa, son of Lucius, built during his 3rd consulate. It was destroyed in a fire of 80 Common Era. Thus, he reconstructs the original text here, also showing that he is not as megalomaniacal as earlier emperors, and also points to the reason why he's so popular.
The design, as Just Gaugier is going to argue, is entirely by Hadrian's own hand, and was influenced by Pythagorean cosmology, specifically numerology, and Roman astrology. The temple front seen here is actually octastyle and is going to showcase the association of the Pantheon and its indebtedness to the Parthenon. Hence, Hadrian is connecting himself to the golden age of Pericles and to the great leaders of ancient Athens. Thus, he also is overseeing a golden age in ancient Rome. The same type of illusions were brought up by Augustus with his commission, such as the Areopagus Augusti. Now, we're retaining, despite the fact that it's a hybrid structure, the single entry point, which is taken from earlier Republican temples. As we move through one section, you cannot enter the Pantheon from the back where the drum is.
On the inside, we see that the Pantheon is a concentric sphere, 142 feet in diameter. So you find that it stands up and/or the ceiling, this hemispherical dome, is supported by solid concrete with 20-foot thick walls at the base forming this drum. We find that as we move up to the upper section, we alleviate or eliminate much of the weight by adding pumice and/or more lightweight aggregate to the concrete mixture. The oculus is going to, of course, allow light into the structure and ventilation, much like a chimney, but it also relieves the weight, distributing the weight of the dome back down to the drum instead of in the center where the oculus would be.
The idea of distributing the lateral force or thrust of the dome made of concrete was earlier discovered and perfected by way of architects like Severus and Keller, who are going to work for Nero, producing the Domus Aurea, where we also see domed interior spaces with oculi.
Thus, the effect is unlike anything else known in the world and is envied by architects and civilizations hereafter, for we have a unified interior that is uninterrupted by supports. And we can see this unified spherical understanding in this structure that celebrates the 7 planetary deities. Hence, this would have been reinforced earlier with bronze rosettes or stars gleaming in the coffering in the ceiling. So here we have the original colored marble that survives from antiquity because the Pantheon was converted to a Christian church very early on in Christianity's legalization and history. So the separate niches are dedicated now to saints and not to Roman gods. The plan of the Pantheon illustrates its difference from that of its Greek predecessor. We do not have columns supporting the structure in the center like a hypostyle hall all the way back to Egypt and Karnak. Instead, the structure supports itself by a drum, this circular drum that surrounds the interior walls. We find that there is not one cult statue, but 7 here dedicated to 7 different gods. Therefore, the symbolism inherent in the Pantheon should be apparent at this point, because it represents the orb of the earth and the dome of the heavens. It represents the cosmos as above us. The hemispherical dome represents heaven and/or the stars and bodies in the sky. We occupy the central section in the notion we inherited from the Greek cosmos, this flat area in the middle, and below us, completing the sphere, is going to be Hades or Tartarus.
Interestingly enough, Hadrian's horoscope can be read around the oculus. Thus we find that Apollo, his divine father, would be granting him imperial authority, for Apollo can be seen, of course, as the sun, the oculus, letting in light to the interior space. And the bronze rosettes, of course, would just further illustrate the interpretation of this as the dome or orb of heaven. Please take a moment to watch the section in Engineering and Empire on the Pantheon to understand how this structure was created. Along with these great structures, Hadrian would also build a monument as his tomb, his mausoleum, that would associate and cement his ties with Augustus. And, of course, the idea of the great emperors and the good emperors before him. So the official imperial tomb, beginning with Tiberius, who was Augustus's successor, would be this mausoleum, which is a circular design with cypress trees planted around it, much like a Tholos temple. Now, Trajan's imperial tomb is actually going to be at the base of his column, as we discussed. Hadrian, on the other hand, opts for a much more elaborate and large mausoleum for himself, which is going to be begun in 125 Common Era, but not completed until 140. It would be the new imperial mausoleum for himself and his successors, and it was on the west bank of the Tiber River facing that of Augustus's. Today, of course, it is going to be right next to the Vatican. It was converted into a papal fortress in the Middle Ages, now being called the Castel San Angelo, or the Castle of the Angel. The angel, Saint Michael, of course, originally would have been a massive nude statue of the emperor himself, like the Hellenistic portraits before him, standing on this massive circular drum, 69 feet in diameter, with an extensive marble podium that is elevated a further 33 feet above. Originally, just as with the mausoleum of Augustus, we would have had planted here cypress trees as you have in cemeteries. So when you go to Europe today and see rows of cypress trees, you can follow them to a cemetery. This tradition begins in the ancient Mediterranean and is popularized by the Romans. Now here we have this understanding of a similarity and proximity to that of Augustus is supposed to indicate that he is the worthy successor of the founder of the Pax Romana, of this Roman peace that would last for 2 centuries. Not surprisingly, given his popularity, Hadrian is going to be proclaimed a god at his death by the Senate, thus, of course, bringing an end to this era and entering into a new section as we approach the late Empire with the Antonines and the Severins we'll discuss next time.